Um, First of all, thank you so much for coming to my talk. I am excited. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you to Isa and Aiden for inviting me. So my talk is called She Has Two Sons, Reproducing State Discourses in Rural China. Teacher Yuan, Fan, and Fan's friend and I were on a photographic outing one pleasant Sunday. Teacher Yuan was the teacher and owner of a yoga studio where I lived while I conducted field work in Huangshan, a municipal region in southern Anhui province. Fan was a yoga student in her late 30s who worked as a receptionist for a state-run enterprise. She was also one of Yuan's closest friends. Today, Fan had brought along another woman she had met through her work, the wife of a wealthy hotelier from Fujian, who was temporarily living in Huangshan. We had traveled to a park in a neighboring county to have our photos taken by teacher Yuan, who was an avid photographer. We were in front of stone memorial archways, elaborate constructions built during the Qing dynasty to commemorate virtuous widows. In the rest of China, these archways had by and large been torn down during the Cultural Revolution, but in Huangshan, they remained standing in rice paddies and generally around the countryside. To match the traditional scenery, teacher Yuan asked that we wear qi pao, fitted silky dresses with a high mandarin collar. Fan wore a pale pink qi pao with a pastel floral pattern. I wore an off-white one with black embroidered flowers, an old one of Fan's that she had given me for photo shoots. Unlike our cheap polyester satin ones that resembled those worn by waitresses at restaurants, Fan's friend wore a real silk qi pao. It was a dark gold color with black embroidery. After we complimented her on how beautiful it was, she told us that it had cost over 8,000 yuan, or about $1,200 US. Fan and I gasped. No wonder it looks so beautiful, said Fan. After the photo shoot, we returned to our cars. Fan and I got in teacher Yuan's white Buick, while the friend returned to her black SUV. Now that we were apart, teacher Yuan and Fan didn't hold back in criticizing Fan's friend. Her skin was dark, and she looked much older than her age. She had a round moon face. She makes an 8,000 yuan qi pao look like an 80 yuan qi pao, Fan quipped. Yuan asked how rich Fan's friend was, and Fan answered, she has two sons. Yuan's eyebrows raised and her lips pursed disapprovingly. In this talk, I explore what sort of moral economy must be in place to make Fan's answer appropriate to Yuan's question. How can the number and gender of children reflect material wealth? And why is having two sons worthy of moral opprobrium? More broadly, how does family composition relate to the construction of moral personhood in rural China? And what role do state logics play in shaping these moral judgments? I will show how state discourses and logics create moral economies that are experienced in gendered ways in daily life, even in the most intimate of family relationships, such as that between mothers and daughters. I argue it is not through the direct imposition of state ideology, but rather through structuring the structures of daily life, through moral and linguistic categories, that the state still continues to mediate the lives of women in rural China. Here, I look at what sorts of work women undertake in order to understand their own selves, both as mothers and as daughters. I examine what sorts of ideology of value must be in place for a woman with two sons to be viewed as selfish or even greedy, a woman with one daughter as modern, and a woman with multiple daughters and a son as traditional. That is, I show how the archetypes of motherhood in rural China are shaped by discourses of both the developmentalist calculus of the current CCP, as well as the legacies of Maoist morality. So in this talk, I will provide a brief background on the one-child policy. I will then focus on how state slogans such as having girls is good affect or are mobilized by women in their daily lives. Then I will turn to these Maoist and contemporary archetypes to see how they continue to shape the values of motherhood and of personhood for women in rural China. And then finally, I will show how women's reproductive choices as mothers in turn impact their relationship with daughters. So in the final section, I will focus on the mother-daughter relationship. Okay. The one-child policy, officially known as the family planning policy, was in effect from 1980 until 2015 and strictly limited the number of offspring a couple was allowed to have. The policy was motivated by both environmental concerns about overpopulation, but also by a belief that China's economic and social development would only be possible if the great quantity of Chinese masses were replaced by fewer, higher quality, quote unquote, citizens capable of turning China into a developed, fully industrialized country. Quantity over quality was the ideology that the state used to promote the policy, reviving a previously obscure philosophical term, 素质, to mean human quality. And here you can see this in the following state propaganda poster: to increase the quality of the populace, good birth and good rearing, the name of one of the state campaigns, is very important. And although examples of forcible coercion did exist, the primary mechanism for enforcing compliance with the policy was economic and social. Those employed in state enterprises faced demotion or job loss if they violated the one-child policy. And in rural areas, and for those not employed by the state, punishment was levied in form of an excess child fine, which varied based on income. In the 1990s, the one-child policy was relaxed in rural China to counter the increasingly imbalanced sex ratio at birth, which reached as high as 138 boys for every 100 girls in parts of the country, including in the province of Anhui, where I worked. To prevent the abortion of female fetuses or the abandonment of baby girls, in early 2000s, the government implemented the Care for Girls campaign. In addition to allowing rural residents permit holders to have a second child if the first child was a girl, the campaign outlawed doctors from informing expectant parents of fetal sex during ultrasounds and also paid for the school fees of rural families with 2 daughters, a program made obsolete when the government abolished all school fees in 2010. Having girls is good. Daughters are better than sons. One middle-aged woman of a teenage daughter would frequently say during conversation at the yoga studio where I was living, she would always point out to her friends the nice things her daughter did for her that a son might not do. Her daughter liked to cook and would sometimes surprise her mother by having dinner ready when she, the mother, returned from work. A son wouldn't do that, she would tell her friends, also middle-aged mothers, and they would nod in agreement. Daughters are good. Having a daughter is good. 女儿好,生一个女儿好, she and her friends would tell each other. In the countryside, I heard girls are good from rural mothers of daughters as well. In a small wonton stand in a remote rural village where I taught English classes, the 23-year-old daughter of the owner sat with her 3-month-old daughter. 小一个脸和, she said to me in the local dialect. Do you know what that means? Having a daughter is good, I smiled. Your Xiongning talk is good. 小一个脸和, she repeated to me, this time at her daughter, and her mother took a break from folding wontons. 小一个脸和, the grandmother repeated, smiling at the granddaughter. We all nodded in agreement. Son preference was combated through a ubiquitous slogan campaign in both rural and urban or urbanizing areas. In villages, slogans were painted in red on the walls of houses, while in cities they were presented here in more modern formats, like this sign in the grass from a city park, pictured in my slide. Although government slogans frequently get dismissed by scholars and locals alike as being ineffectual or even counterproductive, I found that women frequently repeated them in casual conversation. In particular, women who had daughters were very keen to show their enlightened attitudes. Girls are part of the ancestral lineage too. Yu, a college-educated civil servant in her early 30s and a mother of a daughter, told me. Her words closely echoed the red slogan pictured here, which says, "Daughters are also descendants." We can understand what sort of work is being done by the repetition of government slogans by women in casual conversation by seeing it as a form of gnomic calibration. According to Michael Silverstein, gnomic calibration is the lamination of a separate ontic realm onto a present sign event through the use of language, making the present event appear to occur simultaneously in both realms. In doing so, gnomic calibration imbues the present event with the authority of this ontic realm. In this case, then, we can see how the precise lexical repetition of the wording of the slogan, "Having a daughter is good," gnomically calibrates the utterance of the particular woman with the authority of the CCP and the values of gender equality and modernity. Her statement is no longer simply her opinion, but rather an assertion of a state-sanctioned viewpoint. In doing so, she is giving both her authority to her speech while simultaneously reaffirming the legitimacy of the state to have such authority. Here then, we can see how the uptake of, quote, propaganda works in daily life outside of 1984-style dystopian imaginaries. State slogans, which come already fused with the values of the CCP, get recruited into the micro-interactions to the interests and goals of a particular woman. At the same time, however, one might argue that the constant repetition of such a refrain reflects an underlying anxiety that perhaps girls are not so good, that the desirability of girls must be constantly reaffirmed in a way that is not required for sons. Indeed, even among women who told me repeatedly that having a daughter is good, underlying son preference as the presumed default would come out in moments of relative inattention. For example, Peng was a young woman who had moved from outside the region to marry a local man. She had just given birth to a son and was dealing with a scandalously negligent mother-in-law who refused to help her sit her month, 坐月子, a postpartum tradition where the new mother and baby are intensively cared for by older female relatives. As Peng had no local family, the task fell solely to her mother-in-law, as was traditional. Her mother-in-law's negligence was surprising to other women, as after all, Peng had given birth to a son. "What mother-in-law won't care for a grandson?" exclaimed the same women who repeatedly told me that daughters are good. Here we can see how son preference, like so many cultural defaults, is remarked upon in its absence. Had Peng given birth to a daughter, my informants would not have found it so surprising that her mother-in-law might not be interested in helping her sit her month. Indeed, older mothers of daughters often had stories of neglect or even physical abuse at the hands of their mothers-in-law after giving birth to girls. Fan, one of two daughters born in the early 1970s, was once recounting a story of her childhood in a small mountain hamlet. After a pause, she explained that the reason her parents only had two daughters was due to their frequent separations due to work. No one had remarked on the number or gender of her parents' offspring, yet Fan, herself the mother of an only daughter, had found it unusual enough that her parents did not have any sons in the pre-family planning area that she thought it required an explanation to her audience of young, urban Huangshanese women. Yet even if they do not fully believe it, I argue that the slogans do provide women with a language to express the idea of the value of girls, and by extension, the woman's own value as a mother and as a daughter. While women may constantly need to seek out assurance that having, or perhaps being, a girl is okay, these state slogans, consciously or not, provide the framework with which they may reassure each other. In this, we can see how state projects unfold on the ground to mediate women's daily experience and to shape women's value systems. These campaigns do real, if subtle, work to give women concrete, socially acceptable, and importantly, authoritative language through which to express their thoughts. The state neither simply reinforces pre-existing thought processes nor completely changes attitudes out of the blue, but rather subtly shapes them. We might see this form of gnomic calibration then as an achievement, a ritual success that laminates the speech of women with the authority of the state. Importantly, by providing women with authoritative language through which to express themselves, the state then also reinforces its own authority as an authority, that is, as a vanguard of modernity progress and a mediating presence in women's lives. Their verbatim repetition of state slogans also reflects a deeper commitment on the part of the rural-ish women with whom I worked to the explicit state values of modernity, civilization, and more importantly, an acceptance of the state logics which link together the number and gender of children with the ethical contrasts such as modern versus traditional, selfish versus selfless, and progressive versus backward. These connections are the products of particular discourses that come out of a particular history surrounding state family planning policy in the 1970s and early 80s. As I mentioned earlier, in official state discourse, the one-child policy was framed as promoting quality over quantity, claiming fewer births per couple would result in a higher quality children that parents could invest more resources in. At a national level, a smaller, higher quality populace was necessary for China to progress towards an industrialized, prosperous future and eventually full communism. To follow the one-child policy, therefore, was to put the good of the nation over the good of the individual family, and to recognize that the short-term individual sacrifice was often necessary for the long-term good of all. To properly adhere to the one-child policy, then, was to be civilized and enlightened in a socialist manner. To violate the one-child policy was to demonstrate oneself as incapable of thinking about the good of the nation, either through ignorance, a product of a traditional mindset, or individual selfishness, a product of bourgeois capitalist thought. Although in many ways quite removed from Maoism, in these logics, we can see the echo of the Chinese Communist Party's original twin evils of feudalism on the one hand and capitalism on the other. In the 1950s, the party promoted Marxist ideology to a semi-literate rural population through cartoons, where the feudalist and the capitalist existed as caricatured villains. Although long gone from state media, these archetypes still existed in the moral judgments of women in Huangshan, who judged the character of their friends, neighbors, and relatives through family size and composition, according to these state logics. The size and composition of one's family, therefore, was seen to be a public, social, and political statement about what sort of woman one was. A woman with one son was a different kind of woman than a one with one daughter. She, in turn, was different from one with multiple daughters and a son, who was different yet from a woman with multiple sons. Like state slogans, state regimes of value and the logics which underpin them provided an authoritative way for women to structure their own moral values and to justify their own behaviors to others, as well as to judge those around them. In Huangshan more generally, son preference was still quite marked, especially among older and rural people. To not produce a son was a form of selfishness, Auntie Chu, a woman in her late 50s, told me, as it was privileging one's own wants over the needs of the larger family. She was currently embroiled in a years-long fight with her own daughter, Li, who had given birth to a daughter 5 years ago and refused to try for a son. Li's reasoning to her mother was that one child was plenty and she and her husband could not afford to pay the excess child penalty. To me privately, Li admitted she found being a mother hard and did not want another child, something she wasn't able to say to her own mother. Her mother, who had offered to help her cover the excess child fine, thought her daughter was being selfish and lazy. She saw her daughter's contentment with only a daughter as reflecting poorly on her own parenting, thus shaming her to her daughter's husband's family. When Auntie Chu had given birth herself in the early 1980s, the one-child policy did not make allowances for rural population, and so she and her husband, both peasants, had sold everything they owned to have a son. Both she and Li's mother-in-law had refused to help provide childcare for their young granddaughter as punishment for Li not trying for a son, quite a severe sign of disapproval in a culture where both grandparents are expected to provide free childcare, especially when the mother must work to support the family. Having a son then was not simply an issue of personal preference. Many young women told me personally that they would prefer a daughter, but that it wasn't worth it given the pressure and disapproval from the in-laws. Women with rural residence permits who were allowed a second child if the first were a daughter felt less pressure to have a son the first time. And in fact, many said the whole family had hoped for a girl so that they might be allowed to have a second child, as a daughter and a son was considered a more balanced family. The loss of this privilege was a major source of discontent for formerly rural residence permits it was a source of discontent toward government urbanization campaigns. As many newly urban residents told me, they had had rural residence permits in the 90s and 2000s when it was at a disadvantage. And finally, when rural residency came with tangible benefits, the government had forced them to switch to urban residence permits. Although it is illegal for ultrasound technicians to reveal the sex of the baby before birth, the second birth sex ratios indicate that the second birth is rarely left to chance. Indeed, women told me that to get around the law, they could bribe the ultrasound technician into letting them know if the fetum were handsome versus pretty, but only for a second or subsequent child. The unmarked family in Twinchi, therefore, was then either a single son or an older daughter and a younger son, depending on rural or urban status. This family composition indicated that a woman had satisfied to the best of her abilities both national law and her husband's family. While family composition might be identical, having a daughter and a son indicated a very different type of urban woman compared to the rural woman. An urban woman with 2 children had broken the law to have a, quote, illegal son. Such a woman put tradition above the rule of law, and such represented backwardness. Luoho. This sort of woman was to be pitied, as she was a victim to either an overbearing mother-in-law, and it was always the mother-in-law, or to her own limited mindset. An urban woman with a daughter and a son was no different from a rural woman with multiple daughters and a son, except perhaps in the degree of desperation. Women who had birthed multiple daughters until having a son were a source of gossip at the yoga studio, where family size and composition was a frequent topic of conversation. Sui, a woman in her late 50s, told a story of a distant relative of hers who had had 5 daughters before finally having a son. She just kept having them one after another, she said, a look of disgust on her face. The other women shook their heads and murmured, "Oh, how backward." "She's really too traditional," continued Sui. For the women at the yoga studio, mostly bureaucrats and members of the newly urban working classes, they saw themselves as modern women, and in contrast, such a woman was a cautionary tale of the failure of socialist modernity to fully penetrate the feudal countryside. By contrast, with few exceptions, a woman with 2 sons in either the country or the city was a completely different type of woman. For the law-abiding women of the yoga studio, this sort of woman was not to be pitied but disliked, as she represented the greedy entrepreneur who used children as a form of conspicuous consumption. To carry on the family name, 1 son would be sufficient. A second son was therefore excessive, a son that served no purpose except to provide a large strain on the family's resources, as his parents would be responsible for providing a house and a car upon marriage. A second son was also a sign that one could afford the stiff fines. To the poorly paid bureaucrats and working class people I spent time with, the greedy entrepreneur, like the corrupt official, and they were often considered to be one and the same, threatened the moral and social fabric of Chinese society. Women who broke the law to have a single son were, after all, putting their traditional duty and the needs of family above their own personal desires. By a different moral framework, the one held by older women like Auntie Chu, these women were being selfless in their own way. Yet women who broke the law to have an excess son were not in any way caught between traditional and modern duties. Fan's friend, the wife of the wealthy hotelier, represented this sort of woman. Although she and her husband owned properties in Huangshan, they were not part of the local social fabric. They represented the most elite class in the region, which was made up of outside investors who flitted in and out from Shanghai, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Fujian, absentee landlords who were thought to parasitically suck the wealth out of Huangshan and give them nothing in return. We might see in teacher Yuan and Fan's harsh judgment of the hotelier's wife as a site of cross-scalar conflict, as Yuan and Fan's local regimes of value come into contact with those of a national elite. Indeed, we might sense that the harsh and perhaps petty moral judgment of teacher Yuan and Fan is a form of reversing the normal hierarchies, a sort of weapon of the weak that allows them to feel superior to a woman who is economically much more successful. Among local women too, to have two sons was to represent a form of selfish lawlessness that reflected little concern for others. Li, Auntie Chu's daughter, had taken a job as an assistant at a clothing store. She worked as the only employee in a tiny storefront in a working class neighborhood near the train station. Her boss, also a woman in her mid-30s, was a distant relative of Li's husband. One afternoon while I was with Li at the clothing store, her boss brought up the topic of when Li was going to have a second child. Li, who had withstood her mother's daily pressure, demurred. She had an urban residence permit and no money to pay the second child fine. The boss brushed aside her concerns as naivete. She, the boss, had just had her second child not too long ago, a second son. With the help of a relative in government and a well-placed bribe, she and her husband had hidden most of their assets to appear on paper much poorer than they actually were. As fines were calculated in proportion of income, she had paid a minor slap on the wrist rather than a financially ruinous amount. Li and I were shocked at both the number of crimes her boss had committed, as well as the flippant way she mentioned them and encouraged Li to do likewise. Later, Li told me she could never defraud the government like that, as it was an immoral thing to do. Finally, there was the urban woman with one daughter and the rural woman with two daughters. This woman had fully complied with the law to the detriment of her own family duties. What might be framed as simple bad luck, that is, to conceive daughters rather than sons, was reframed by local women, such as the bureaucrats or newly urban working class, as an agentive act of being modern. Such a woman had fully embraced both the government's exhortation that daughters were equal to sons, as well as the government's exhortation to put the collective good ahead of personal gain. Lei Feng, a model worker, peasant, and soldier, and a mainstay of Cultural Revolution propaganda, had returned to Huangshan on ubiquitous billboards and posters, exhorting us to study Lei Feng, devote ourselves to others, and improve ourselves. Having two daughters, then, was a perfect example of embodying Lei Feng's spirit, as these women had sacrificed their family lineage and perhaps even personal status within the family to promote the general good of evening out China's sex ratio imbalance. These archetypes, the modern socialist woman, the feudal traditionalist, and the bourgeois capitalist, were present in women's judgments on family size and composition, but were not reducible to them, nor were they totalizing static categories that necessarily defined all women in all families. Rather, these moral frameworks were always relational, and these categories were mobilized discursively among women in particular contexts for particular ends. Like most gossip, the worst offenders were almost never present, but rather invoked by the speaker to create certain relations with those present in the room. When Sui disapprovingly told us of her distant relative who had God knows how many daughters, she was recruiting the other women present in the yoga studio to share with her a sense of superiority over her backward relative, inviting them to share this sense of modern and urban pity. Regardless of how urban or modern, or even how many daughters the women present might have, they might rest assured it was fewer than Sui's relative, and thus they too could share in the judging. These same women also praised Chen, a young bureaucrat in her early 30s with a good job in a university education, for having a second daughter after their forms allowed a couple to have a second child if both parents were themselves only children. To Chun's face, they praised her enlightened decision to have another girl and complimented her husband for being so open-minded. Yet in another context, these same women privately pitied Chun, who took a gamble on a second child only to end up with a second daughter, or as the expression went, to try to steal the chicken only to end up losing the rice. Likewise, when teacher Yuan and Fan recruited me into their judgment of the hotelier's wife, or Li in her judgment of her boss, they invited me to share with them their sense of moral rectitude, condemning those who would do what was easy or profitable rather than what was right. In this sense, my own role as an American anthropologist helped them reverse the hierarchy. Our combined judgment that the condemnation would not simply be the jealousy of a poorer or socially inferior woman for her superior, but rather my cooperation reinforced the position of the judgment as representing the position of the truly modern and civilized. And of course, these frameworks were not universal or totalizing, but rather tied to certain positionalities. In this case, mothers of daughters, government bureaucrats, and other women who had a personal interest in publicly supporting the values of the state. These set of values existed alongside other evaluative frameworks that were present to greater or lesser degrees in Huangshan. Women whose behavior led others to judge them as traditional or bourgeois did not necessarily define themselves in such terms. Indeed, women like Auntie Chu saw sacrificing to have a son as a form of selfless filial piety. To not try for a son was putting the ease of daily life over the consequence of breaking the ancestral line. Li's boss, and I would assume Fan's friend as well, would see themselves as not greedy but clever, private individuals who had figured out how to circumvent oppressive state meddling into familial and affairs and reproductive rights. To someone like Li's boss, Li and those like her were dangerously naive and perhaps incomprehensibly trusting in a government that had at best a complex relationship with its rural citizens. This trust was a sort of a simple country mindset, a type of bumpkinness that was reflective of a larger lack of savvy that was necessary to succeed in China's cutthroat economy. And although this is outside the scope of this talk, we might see in Li's boss a common attitude that was somewhat curiously lacking among the people I worked with in Huangshan, and the idea that the market, not the state, was the driver of China's progress toward modernity. Throughout this discussion, I hope it is clear that my argument is that people are neither motivated solely through self-interest nor through an unwavering commitment to an abstract moral ideology, but rather that people operated through strategies of calculated interest that were simultaneously self-serving and genuinely motivated. For example, Li did not like being a mother. She found raising her daughter exhausting. Yet at the same time, she was not simply instrumentally manipulating state law as an alibi. Her belief that her daughter was enough, that girls were good, was genuine, as was her horror at her boss's cavalier greed for cheating the system to have a second son. Women's reproductive decisions did not just affect their relationship with their peers, that is, their friends, family, and neighbors, but also had profound influence on their relationship with their own children, especially their daughters, as I will turn to in the final part of my talk. Your little brother cannot replace you. I was spending a long weekend with one, a 33-year-old civil servant in the city finance department. One was a single woman in her 30s, a bit of an anomaly in a place where most women were married by 25. That weekend, her mother was visiting from one's hometown several hours away to cook and clean for one, as she did periodically. As usual, the topic turned to one's mother's favorite topic, which was, when was she going to get married and have a baby? After 10 years of the same conversation, one was no longer interested in discussing her romantic failures with her mother. She said, after some prolonged nagging on the topic, one turned to her mother and said snappishly, "Why do you care if I get married and have a kid? You have my little brother to do that for you." One was referring to the illegal little brother her mother had gone into hiding to have when one was 10. One's mother was taken aback. She paused for a moment and then said rather deliberately, "Your little brother cannot replace you. 弟弟不能替代你." In the remainder of this talk, I will look at how women's strategies to either obey or circumvent the one-child policy influence mother-daughter relationships in rural-ish China. In a society where scholars have taken the mother-son relationship, or the uterine family in the terms of Marjorie Wolf, as the core of the Chinese family unit, the mother-daughter relationship has been relatively neglected. Mother-daughter relationships are, of course, complex, but the one-child policy meant that having a son often required significant sacrifice that made the family's preference for a male child particularly transparent. To daughters, now mostly in their 20s and 30s, knowing that the mother had sacrificed the family's material wealth, and in some cases a chance for a relationship with her own daughter, created a complicated and often fraught relationship. For these daughters, the one-child policy laid bare the extent to which their mother would go to have a son, the extent to which they as daughters were not enough. For their mothers, the costs of having a second or third child were tangibly acute. Women who went into hiding to have a son were separated from young daughters for months or even years at a time. If we return to the argument between one and her mother, we might pay attention to what Judith Irvine calls shadow conversations. That is, quote, the set of dialogic relations that are crucially informed by other sets, shadow conversations that surround the conversation at hand, end quote. Here we can see that one and her mother are not simply talking about one's little brother's ability to produce a grandchild. One, an only child for 10 years, had been deeply hurt when her mother had left the family to give birth to a son. The dynamics of son preference are complicated, as we have seen, and even women's agentive choices cannot be said to be made freely outside of internal and external pressure. From her childhood perspective, however, one felt that the choice was solely her mother's, as she remembers her father being content with just a daughter. One also saw the choice as financially and socially reckless. Her father worked as a bureaucrat, and had his office discovered her brother's birth, he could have lost his job or been permanently demoted, leading to potentially permanent and catastrophic financial and social consequences. One's little brother had been raised by her paternal grandmother until age 5, at which point he moved in with the family. They had just 3 years together before one left for college, and she made no effort to cultivate a relationship with him. Although Wen did not frame it in such precise terms, it is not a great leap to assume that much of one's anger toward her mother came from the feeling that she as a girl was not enough in her mother's eyes. In her eyes, her little brother, raised as a second only child, had in many ways replaced her, given her mother the proper family she had not achieved with a daughter. In order to do so, one's mother had been prepared to sacrifice one's own future by risking her husband's prestigious and stable employment. As an adult, one was college educated, had a good job, and lived in a nice apartment she'd bought with financial help from her parents, all things that would not have likely been possible had her father lost his job. Although from an external perspective, one's mother remained a caring mother to her, coming by once a month to cook, clean, and do her daughter's laundry. For one, this external demonstration of motherly care could not replace the fundamental sense that she had been replaced, and the stakes of that replacement had been high. In this conversation, we can see one's mother pushing back against one's anger and letting her know that she would valued her as her own daughter, irreplaceable by anyone else, even a desired son. While one was very vocal about her sense of her mother's betrayal and her anger, other women chose to be quieter. Peng, the woman who had given birth to a son whose mother-in-law refused to help care for, Peng's own mother had given birth to 2 girls and then chose to have another child, a son. Peng was the second and middle child, and she saw it as a bonding point between the 2 of us. We both have a brother and a sister, and we're both middle children, she'd say to me, noting that it was a relative rarity amongst her cohort. While I helped Peng sit her month after her mother-in-law had refused, the 2 of us would share all sorts of intimate life details that come from being cooped up and sleep deprived with a newborn. Toward the end of my fieldwork, Peng invited me to visit her parents' home, an invitation she hadn't extended to any of her Chinese friends in Huangshan. I met her parents, her older sister, and her younger brother. Her brother, who helped run the family plastic bag recycling factory, said to me, "I have another older sister, you know." "Yes, I know. She collects scrap metal and lives around the corner," I said, referring to Peng's older sister. No, I have another older sister, Peng's younger sister. She was born just a year after Peng, and our parents gave her away to an aunt, he told me. I was taken aback. Peng, who talked about everything, had never once breathed a word about her other sister, the one who was given away. When I met this sister, who also happened to live around the corner, Peng introduced me to her as her Biao Mei, or younger maternal cousin. In China, it is extremely common to informally refer to one's cousins as brother or sister, for example, Mei Mei, rather than Biao Mei, younger maternal cousin. But I noticed that Peng never dropped the Biao when referring to this cousin. It was a highly marked form of distancing, and one that seemed unique to Peng among all her family. And although Peng and I had few secrets, I never asked her why she had never told me about this other sister, or why, even when her own brother called this sister Mei Mei, Peng insisted on the somewhat stilted informal Biao Mei. I didn't ask her, though I wanted to, if Peng ever wondered if perhaps her parents had considered giving her away instead, or if that her sister's fate was too uncomfortably close to hers, that acknowledging such her sister would require Peng to acknowledge her own precariousness in her family. When Peng was a baby, her parents had left her with her paternal grandmother and gone into hiding with the oldest sister to have first her sister and then her brother. Peng was raised by her grandmother and did not live with her parents until age 10. At 12, she boarded in the county middle school, so to Peng, her parents weren't really parents. They're more like friends than parents. They didn't really raise me. That was my grandmother. She was more like my mom. Peng also recounted how her family had been relatively well off before her brother was born, but after having her brother, the local cadres had taken all their furniture as punishment, even their TV. It was ridiculous. 很可笑, she said somewhat enigmatically. Peng knew her parents cared for her. They welcomed her home with loving arms when the loneliness of Huangshan became too much, and they supported her financially as best they could, giving her and her husband several thousand yuan to buy a car. But as Peng told me, her family was traditional and she was just a daughter. The family needed to save money to buy an apartment on the city outskirts for her brother so that he might marry and carry on the family line. They could ill afford to devote much time, money, or energy to support their second daughter, even when she needed help, for example, sitting her month. Their inability to help was why she was left alone during her critical postpartum period with only a foreign anthropologist by her side. In the subject of gender, mothers and daughters in urban China, Harriet Evans notes that state policies under Mao often led to prolonged separation of mothers and daughters, as mothers were sent to work or study far away from their families in the 1950s and 60s. This physical estrangement in many cases led to emotional estrangement, as her interviewees recalled the feelings of neglect or abandonment they felt as children. In a similar way, the experiences of Wen and Peng mirror those of the urban 1950s generation, giving rise to similar feelings of distance or estrangement. In this case, the seemingly voluntary nature of the separation added another layer of complexity. The emotional effects of separation were compounded, particularly in Wen's case, by the idea that such a separation was her mother's choice. In formal interviews I conducted, as well as in daily conversation, a preliminary pattern of women expressing they felt closer to their fathers than their mothers began to emerge. Guo, an epidemiologist in her mid-40s, mentioned that she preferred her father, as she felt that her mother loved her older brother more. The father-daughter relationship was often framed in reaction to the mother-son relationship, as fathers were seen to take an interest in daughters who saw themselves as second best to sons in their mother's eyes. Yet in this, we can still see the centrality of the mother-daughter relationship. Father's interest in their daughters was not assumed, and therefore a father's affection for his daughter was something to be remarked on. As a corollary, a mother's lack of emotional care for her daughter was experienced as a lack precisely because a mother's care was assumed as default. Likewise, women's responses of feeling as though their fathers valued them more than their mothers also points to the way that women are experienced as agents of enforcing what might be seen as patriarchal or traditional norms, something that has been noted by scholars of gender, both in China and in other parts of the world. In a society which is still primarily patrilocal and patrilineal, The women I worked with experienced or imagined the difficulties of marrying into a new family, primarily through the figure of the mother-in-law. When I talked to my unmarried friends about future husbands, desires for a particular sort of mother-in-law were always mentioned along with fantasies about the husband. Fan, who had fled an abusive marriage 5 years earlier, framed her husband's abuse as instigated by her mother-in-law, who had also physically abused her. Indeed, given the ingrained cultural images of mothers as teachers and caretakers, violent men were thought to have been nurtured by equally violent and cruel mothers. Of course, while women may indeed be violent and cruel, and may indeed relish the act of wielding power over subordinates, perhaps seeing it as a reward for surviving the hardships of life as a young bride and a young mother themselves, feminist scholars have noted that it is one feature of patriarchy that masks the underlying power relationships in a way that makes women seem responsible. Here we can see how one's anger at her mother, as responsible for choosing to have her younger brother, masks the way other larger structural power relations constrained and shaped one's mother's choices. Indeed, in my interviews, I found that it was often only once becoming mothers themselves that women became closer to their mothers, a finding similar to Evan's. Tsai, a 32-year-old professor of tourism at the local university, noted that after having her own child, she could finally understand, and here she uses the Chinese word lijia, to understand on a deep level, her own mother and her mother's hardships. As mothers, women were forced to make decisions that would impact themselves and their children in ways that they recognized their own children might not understand. In the first two parts of this talk, I've shown how the one-child policy has created frameworks of language and moral value that structure women's decision-making in daily life. In the final part of this talk, I've explored some of the implications of these choices for women as mothers and daughters. Choices made by women as mothers have long-term effects on their daughters. If I had had the chance to have candid conversation with Peng and Wen's mothers, I'm sure I'd find that they too negotiated among the competing demands of family and state policy, perhaps making different choices than their own daughters or daughters-in-law might make. The personal is political, but the political is also personal, as policies help mold even the most intimate relationships between family members. Here I want to return to Wen and her mother. Wen's mother was not deterred by Wen's attempt to brush off her concern. She continued to ask Wen who would care for her in her old age if she didn't marry enough children. Wen reminded her mother that she was a civil servant. She had a pension and health insurance. She didn't need a husband or family. Here we can see yet another way the state shapes opportunities for women in rural China. In her argument with her mother, Wen argues the state can replace family support. In one sense, we might see the state then as providing opportunities for women's economic independence that have created new possibilities for single women. On the other hand, Wen's comment also reflects a glimmer of a much older socialist state discourse, one in which the state's care promised to replace the need for family or other traditional institutions. Thus, in conclusion, we can see how state discourses and their circulation in everyday life in rural China affords women with avenues of discourse and socially recognizable moral categories with which to reimagine gender and family roles. State discourses and the biopolitical policies shape the interpersonal experiences of Chinese women and influence their life choices. Within this context, women make choices that are simultaneously valued and evaluated from the perspective of different discursive frameworks and different value systems. While women's agency is by no means absolute, the multiplicity of evaluative frames offers potential justification for the choices they do make, even though this often creates a double bind through which women are negatively judged regardless of the choices that they make. At the same time, the existence of multiple and often competing regimes of value mean that women ultimately do have to make choices, and in so doing must make rational calculations, weighing the disparate costs and benefits of each choice. Does one violate the one-child policy to appease one's husband family, or risk state fines and social opprobrium as being backward? Or does one forego such an option and therefore face daily censure by one's mother-in-law? Here, I highlight the process of calculus rather than the rationality of the decision-making in the classical sense. As I illustrate in this final section, these choices and the processes of making them have long-term repercussions for women's relationships with their own mothers and daughters, as well as for their own sense of self-conception. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Could you maybe remove the slide so we can go back to the main room? Thank you, Britta, for this fantastic presentation. So I'll give a little bit of time for everyone to collect their thoughts. We're gonna move to the Q&A. So now's the chance to ask any questions you'd like to Britta about her talk or not. And in the meantime, I just want to remind everyone that this talk is recorded, so you can also have access to it later. It will be uploaded on YouTube, and that there are the slides in the chat that Aiden, my co-organizer, shared. So I'll just open the floor to everyone or anyone who would like to ask a question.
And feel free to use the chat or raise your hand to speak.
Well, if no one is ready to speak up now and needs a little bit more time, Britta, I do have a question. I thought it was very nice to have the pictures of the slogans on the walls, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about them, both in terms of, you know, what are the politics of this aesthetic around the city and where specifically in the areas they were located and how you yourself came to discover them.
Yeah, so this is, I think, something that visitors to China might find surprising, but state slogans are really everywhere in both urban, rural areas, large cities, small towns, and they're really posted everywhere. So in cities, oftentimes you have red banners with white lettering, and those can be hung from freeway overpasses. They can be on the sides of buildings. They can be in parks. And so usually the government has many campaigns running. And so these slogans are there to reinforce campaigns. You know, anything from when I was in Beijing in 2006-5, there was a no spitting campaign. And so every sign said, you know, don't spit on the ground, be a civilized person. They can also be, as I showed in areas, they can also be more colorful. And so they can also take the form, I think in the Better Birth campaign slogan, as you can see, it was really more almost like an advertisement. So they'll also take those forms, and they're ubiquitous. So on the sides of buildings, on public walls, as you're driving down a highway, they'll be along the sides of the highways. And then of course in villages, they're often put up mainly with red paint, although sometimes they might be hung as banners. And that's actually still the primary way that the government communicates its its current campaigns.
Thank you so much. And I was also just wondering, because it looked quite old, and yet, you know, these discourses get reproduced even today. I thought there was this interesting sort of contrast between the look of the slogan and how they're still very much alive and everything.
Sarah?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Britta. This was really, really nice to hear and really interesting. And there's so many kind of provocative directions that this is kind of making me think about. And one thing I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about, if you can, is I very much appreciate the laying things out along a kind of rubric of different regimes of value, right? And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what other regimes of value were also kind of intersecting with these decisions and processes of moral evaluation. So for example, I don't know, a regime of kind of narrowly economic value, right? That I would imagine plays into some of this as well. And I don't know enough about the context to guess what else might be an issue. But if you could maybe tell me a little bit more about what are the various regimes of value that are especially relevant to this locus.
Yeah, and so one thing that I think maybe I didn't really fully address in this talk is that I think that the regimes of value at play in Huangshan, my field site, are not necessarily reflective of, certainly not large urban areas where one of the odd, interesting, perhaps lacks, is the lack of the way the one-child policy was felt as an imposition into one's own reproductive freedom. And that certainly is an attitude that, talking to friends living in other parts of the city, part of the country, I mean, I think that is felt very widely, that many women just simply resent sort of the state imposition on reproductive rights or reproductive choice at all. And so I think that this is both somewhat unusual, but I think one of the things that it highlights is that also the way, though, that women's reproductive choices are never made in a vacuum. And so if it's not the state controlling reproduction, there's incredible pressure from the family, again, especially in a place like Huangshan, to have a son. And then on top of that, another calculus that also really got left out of this talk, primarily for length reasons, is that having a son is becoming increasingly expensive. There's an expectation that one has to provide a house, now increasingly a car, to set up the new family. And also, as a result of this sex ratio imbalance, China just has a shortage of women in this marriageable age compared to men. So in rural areas, especially, there's an increasing awareness that having a son is really costly. And in some ways, even one son is perhaps a form of conspicuous assumption. And women would, so for example, Peng, who gave birth to a son, she before having her baby, she'd say, I don't know if I want to have a son, because not only will I have to buy him a house and a car, but I'll have to buy him a wife, which was sort of jokey, but it actually reflects the way that women, there is human trafficking ring between Southeast Asia and now China, where people are buying wives from Southeast Asia. So yeah, sort of the economic calculus is complicated because there is such an ingrained sense of son preference, but it's also being undercut by this idea that sons are economically disadvantageous, and also just a sense that daughters are better children than sons. And so scholars like Vanessa Fong have done research on how there's an idea that women are becoming more filial, and that when you're old, you'd much rather have a daughter because she'll actually visit you every day and take care of you, and a son. And in particularly your daughter-in-law, who is primarily left to do the care, that daughters-in-law don't care for mothers-in-law the way that they care for mothers. So there's a lot of incredible complexity here in these regimes of value that women are simultaneously trying to negotiate. And I hope it comes out in my talk that women are both sort of trying to negotiate this in the most advantageous way that they can, but they're also sort of caught in these double binds. And there's also a lot of real sincerity behind how women are negotiating this. It's not simply instrumental manipulation.
Thanks, Britta.
So there's a question in the chat. Emmanuel says, I'm curious to know how you came to learn Chinese and how you gained access to those local women and family conversations.
Yeah, so I majored in Chinese as an undergraduate. I studied abroad in China. My Chinese actually really improved. I taught English in China to children who mercilessly mocked my Chinese and every flaw. They, humiliated me, and that really motivated me to improve my language skills. And then in terms of access, so I think I mentioned this. I lived in a yoga studio in the municipal seat of Huangshan called Tunqi City. And I was actually assigned housing there by the local government. And the yoga studio was run by the yoga teacher, who I call Teacher Yuan, who is also a cadre. And through this yoga studio, which served as a local women's social club, I got to know women, and then people invited me places. I had in some ways a very passive role as an anthropologist. I sort of just went around with people and sort of like, oh, here I am, and here's my anthropologist. But that worked out well because people generously invited me into their lives, and in some cases to witness even very intimate moments. For example, one's interaction with her mother. It was the three of us one weekend just staying at her house.
We have Rob with a raised hand.
Hello.
Hi.
All right. Yeah. I don't know why it says Rob, but that's not my name. My name is Frank. I'm a student of Professor Ingebretson, actually. So I had a question about something we spoke about in class, which was like leftover women. So if does that play a role in why like families don't want to have a daughter, like the fear of their daughter becoming a like leftover woman?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So leftover women are sort of the idea actually promoted by the All China Women's Federation, sort of creating a sense of fear generally highly educated, career-driven women over ages 25 or 30. Sort of this idea that they had missed their window to marry and were doomed to be old maids. So certainly the fear of not being able to marry was, I think we can see in one's life experience, she was considered to be a leftover woman, and being left out of a kinship structure was considered to be a real tragedy. Not marrying was not seen as an option, especially in a place where traditionally your kinship structure, your family is your social safety net. And so I would say that was less a motivation for not wanting women, but that was something that a lot of women felt pressure, both to marry young and then also to have a son. So for example, I cut one of my vignettes was a woman who did yoga, who lived in a neighboring village. And at 23, she was the oldest unmarried woman in her village, and her parents were really worried. And so she felt intense pressure to get married and then subsequently have to produce a son in quick succession. And so that's another thing that I think that I hope that my research, one of the things that I want to avoid is sort of the idea that just the patriarchy continues on unbroken in rural China. But I want to show how actually sort of there's a lot of, again, interesting sorts of negotiation, or women are operating in social systems that in some ways might appear to be sort of remnants or an unbroken existence of older forms of social structure. And yet there's nothing sort of really traditional about them, how women operate and live in them, and that they also sort of simultaneously hold these side by side with the say, quote unquote, contemporary values of the CCP. And here also, even, for example, this older generation, this 50s and 60s generation, like Auntie Chu, who is the generation putting an enormous pressure for sons on their children, those values exist side by side with, for the this 50s generation, a real overt commitment to the gender equality of Maoism, which they now see it receding from society. So I think one of the things that is true is that people can hold what we might think of as wildly conflicting and different positions, or that say a commitment to gender egalitarianism of Maoism can exist side by side with sort of the idea that a son is needed to carry on the family line.
Can we have Karen?
Hi, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I put my camera on, but I'm gonna turn off later because I'm camera shy today, sorry. But I was really, a lot of things you were seeing for this talk, Britta, were super interesting and really got me thinking about like, and I haven't given this a lot of thought, so I'm kind of a bad anthropologist about kinship. And I was wondering if I noticed that a lot of the people you spoke to were like working for the government or had this kind of like, they referred back to their safety net, right? Of like, oh, the state will take care of me because I have this state job. But I was wondering for people who aren't, right? Like what would the role of the family be, right? In a situation where like, there's like kind of increasing, abandonment by the state. And I was wondering, like, did you talk to anybody who kind of, might have felt pressured to have children precisely because they felt like, without, the idea that without having a child or having children to take care of me, like, I don't know how I would basically be able to live a retired life, like after after I, I'm done with my work or whatever, right? Or I'm too old to keep working. I was wondering, like, if people negotiated those fears of like a future that was kind of precarious. And if so, like, how did that relate to their ideas of how the family should be structured? Yeah, thank you.
Oh, definitely. So certainly, I think one of the things here, one is an anomaly as being an unmarried childless woman in her 30s. Most people were married, if not, by 22 or 23. And the idea of children as optional was really, not having children was by and large seen as very antisocial. And part of that is sort of the idea that you're, you don't have children for you have children for your family. And in part of that is then, of course, you're continuing on this cycle. And I think even among the bureaucrats, most of them still, I think, had this idea that your children are your future and your children are who you're going to rely on. And definitely for the people who don't work for the government too, there's not a sense that there's an old age pension or anything to rely on. So there is, and that's actually one reason why that I didn't talk about, which is what another sources of major dissatisfaction for the urbanization campaigns is this idea that it's spatially disrupting the kinship logics and the idea that you might have a house next to your children who can then take care of you easily, but the idea that that's being broken up. And of course, children are increasingly moving to large cities, either as migrant workers or as white collar workers. And so Huangshan, I think, is unique as a tourist area. It has a lot of very low paying jobs. And the only form of upward mobility in the area is via government, which is, I think, one of the reasons why you see such a reliance on or such sort of a buy-in to state values. So for example, I had a neighbor whose son was an engineer in Shenzhen, and she'd bought her son a house in Huangshan, and she's like, well, he can't even afford a house in Shenzhen. Here he has this mansion. And I was like, well, of course he has a mansion out here, but of course he's not going to move here. And so there is this friend had real angst over, do I move to Shenzhen to be close to my son and potential grandchildren? Or so you're seeing the disruption of, again, sort of patrilocal relationships that is causing a lot of angst, especially among this older generation.
I think Yutong was next.
Thank you, Britta, for your talk. So I would love to hear you elaborate a little bit more on the urban-rural continuum in your research, because I may be wrong, but my feeling is that your field site actually scatters in different positions on the urban-rural continuum and cannot be easily kind of categorized as simply rural. And also, I'm curious, like in your categorization of the archetypes, I noticed that there is a distinction between the rural and urban. So I wonder, like, what factors are there to kind of have this different moral geographies of like offsprings in rural area and urban area, other than the modernization discourse?
No, great, thank you. So yeah, this is something that I think, so especially with the archetype, I'm sort of using rural and urban as shorthand for rural hukou or residence permit and urban residence permit. And so there the difference in the number of composition just reflects, and again, this is now an artifact of the past, because I think there's a 3-child policy nationwide, and maybe pronatalist policies, but that's an artifact of the Care for Girls campaign, which allowed women with rural residence permits to have a second child if the first were a daughter. So so in that case, a family with a daughter and a son may not necessarily have broken the law. And so for the people I worked with, I think the key distinction was, had you broken the 1-child policy or the family planning policy to have an excess child? And if so, was it for a quote unquote good reason, a justifiable reason, i.e. to have a single son? And yeah, I think that I struggle with how to talk about my field site. So my home base was in Tunchi, the municipal seat of the Huangshan area, but I traveled all around the area, and even the spatial logics of rural and urban don't necessarily map onto these legal categories. So for example, you have the government also incorporating at a massive rate farmland into urban areas, and then moving these newly urbanized people into townhouses or sometimes high-rise apartments. And sometimes people still have small plots of land that they farm. Other times they don't. You also, in Huangshan, at least, you had people living in quote unquote rural areas, but you had the development of townships and sometimes a 20-story high-rise. So I think one of the things that I hope that my work will explore is sort of the changing meaning of rural and urban, especially as sort of urban areas or rural areas are becoming urbanized, but they're not ending up looking urban in the way that, say, the center of Beijing might be considered urban.
Thank you.
And Andy's last.
Hi, Britta. Thank you so much for your talk. I think the archetypes and the calculus are both very great ways to bring out the complex moral regimes that are underlying this women's daily life and life choices. And I noticed that you make a very deliberate argument and contribution by shifting the focus from let's see, mother-son relation to mother-daughter relation, right? And also notice that you mentioned the mother-in-law as more of a proxy of the patriarchy at the forefront, at least from the women's perspective. So what I wonder is, like, can you tell us a little bit about the roles or like position of men, especially the husband and father-in-law in this dynamic? If they are like more indirect, like what kind of indirect influence they have on women's choices? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great question, because obviously men are central to patriarchal systems. And so one of the things, and of course, this is an older insight, is how the men do seem to evaporate from the imaginaries of patriarchy as experienced by women. And so that is one thing that I found really interesting, again, is how central the mother-in-law was as a figure in a marriage, to the point where when people talked about future marriages or about their marriage, it really seemed to be this daughter-in-law, mother-in-law dyad rather than the husband-mother dyad, which we might think of as very central in a relationship. And I think part of that is, part of it is since the parents buy the house for the son, the consequence is that as a married woman, you're living in a house owned by your in-laws. And so that creates an incredible power dynamic. And it's funny because for the older generation, they saw it as, we have to spend all our hard-earned money and then give it away to our ungrateful daughter-in-law. But to the daughter-in-law, that's sort of, I have to live in my mother-in-law's house. And it is curious how absent the father-in-law is in all these conversations. One thing that I found interesting, in this perhaps is an artifact of living in a rural-ish region, is how the husband-wife relationship also was considered in not particularly romantic terms. So a lot of women I talked to said, the point of getting married is to have a baby, and then after that, sort of sometimes you and your husband can go in separate ways. It was very a utilitarian notion of a relationship, and I think that this yoga studio I lived in attracted a lot of middle-aged women in their 30s and older. And I think part of it is women saw this as a place to spend time with other married women while their husbands were perhaps off doing other things without them. So a lot of people would say, oh, the fuqi guanqi, the husband-wife relationship, is really only lasts about 3 or 4 years in a marriage, and then it turns into a kinship relationship. And I imagine that's not entirely unique, but I also think it is perhaps a very different notion of what a marriage looks like than you might find in a larger city. And I know someone like, for one, that was not an acceptable concept, that was not an acceptable idea of marriage, which is one of the reasons why she felt like she hadn't met anyone she wanted to truly spend the rest of her life with.
Thank you so much.
Angela Reyes.
Hi. Sorry about that. I just got a phone call at the same time, but Britta, wonderful talk. Your work is always excellent, and today is no exception. So I thank you so much for sharing that. Such, just a comment, just really beautiful work on looking at how different kinds of figures of personhood, of like womanhood, are tied to different kinds of arrangements in terms of mothers or daughters. I'm so sorry. So let me just ask my question. I have to attend to this. State discourses. So I was so fascinated by, or first of all, I love how you just used the idea of gnomic calibration to talk about how the state discourses were being sort of operationalized in everyday kinds of contexts. I think the phrase was maybe girls are good or daughters are good. It really got me thinking about like how we understand what gets understood as a state discourse, and how we then engage in questions about origins and sort of histories of discourse. It made me think immediately about like, is it the anti-maskers or anti-vaxxers campaign is like my body, my choice?
Yes.
Is such like a hilarious sort of, using of a term that has a different kind of history. And so I just, I don't know if this is so much a question, but I just really enjoyed how much that got me thinking about how we trace discourses and how we assign them to particular types of origins. And I was curious if your claim is that these individuals are sort of doing this kind of gnomic calibration with a state discourse, how do we understand that discourse is a state discourse? Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, and one that I also grapple with, because I have this larger question, how does the state mediate people's lives? But of course, few people are ever like, and let me just quote this slogan I passed on my walk over here. So one of the things, and I think that I think for me, something like, again, sometimes it comes down to that precise lexico, syntactic repetition where it may, the origin of the concept may not be located in the state, but it's having that slogan where, again, you're like, oh, well, I don't know where this came from, but it just popped into my head. Oh yeah, girls are part of the ancestral line too. So part of my argument is that even if, these slogans aren't necessarily originating in the state in terms of the idea that girls are valuable, of course, has many other origins besides the CCP. Although in China, the CCP is often seen as the driver of sort of an overt gender egalitarian feminism, going back to really the very earliest period, the Yan'an period, women's literacy, and then women hold up half the sky, Chairman Mao. So there is a very strong ideological linkage between the CCP and feminism, that for the women where I worked, the idea that society was getting less gender egalitarian was seen as a recession of the state. So I think that might be partly where sort of the linkage of the state with this idea, sort of state slogans as girls are good. And I think part of my argument, and even thinking about Tausig actually sort of writes about how, advertising sort of gets in our heads at that moment of inattention where we're not really paying attention, sort of I think he uses the metaphor, the reflection of a puddle. And so one of the things I'm sort of toying with is this idea that if you have these slogans all around you and you're just passing them, just like with billboards and Coca-Cola, even if you're not necessarily like, oh yes, now there's sort of, it's in the atmosphere, and it's there when you need something to draw on. It's a ready-made, it's sort of something, it's a ready-made discourse on which you can hang your thoughts, your otherwise somewhat inchoate thoughts. And so I guess, yeah, that's my answer. On the one hand, certainly at least in rural China, there's a really strong association between the CCP and feminism and sort of valuing women. But then also, because this also comes up with a lot of my other work, for example, there's this Lei Feng campaign and the revival of Cultural Revolution propaganda. And the Cultural Revolution was also a discourse that people talked about all the time. And that was really striking to me, and in very positive ways. And so part of me is wondering if even if few people are saying, oh, I saw that Lei Feng poster, and now I'm thinking about the Cultural Revolution, if there might be some sort of way in which it's sort of priming the well, priming the pump, sort of bringing it back into people's consciousness, and not probably in ways that the present government is hoping to, because people were using the Cultural Revolution to critique the current government. in pretty vivid ways.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We're getting close to the end of the talk. I'd like to invite everyone to give one last warm round of applause for Britta for this fantastic presentation. Britta, thank you so much for coming to this virtual social linguistics lunch meeting. And I just would like to remind everyone of upcoming talks. So on November 12th, we have Khadija Monet-Martin, who will come and present a talk on translanguaging consciousness and intersectionality in the languaging of students in elite NYC independent schools. And on December 10th, we have Felipe Leandro de Jesus from Georgetown University, who will present on interaction, indexicality, and the social linguistic politics of trans identities in Brazil. So I would like to invite you all to come as well for these talks. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have a nice Friday.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
Bye, Britta. Thank you. I will stop the recording now.